Hello and welcome back to the Consistory of the Coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Zabel of St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia, a member congregation of the Confessional Orthodox Evangelical Lutheran Communion. And today, the question that was asked me is that in the epistles to Timothy and Titus, St. Paul says that the requirement of a pastor is that he should basically have his household under control, that his children should obey him and not be wild and disobedient. Therefore, if a pastor has disobedient children, should he be defrocked from the ministry? Whew, that's a bit of a heavy question, but it is true that Paul does in the epistles to Titus, chapter 1, verse 6, and 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 4, says that the requirements for a pastor is that he should be able to manage his own household, because if he can't manage his own household, how is he going to manage the church? That is actually one of the requirements for the office of the ministry. And so the question is, if a pastor's children are being disobedient and he can't control them, should he be defrocked? And the answer is yes and no. Yes, as into there may be some circumstances where that is the case, and know that it's a little bit more nuanced than that you can't just simply defrock someone because their kid played up on Sunday. So, to understand my answer a bit better, we need to look at a few different circumstances and consider what it means for a pastor to be able to control his children. See, there should be a few factors that are considered when we are asking, hey, the pastor's got disobedient children, we should defrock him. The first question is he dealing with adult children or like little children? Because there is a difference here. Because once your children are adults, the Bible tells us that we grow up and we leave father and mother and we cleave to our wife. So once a child grows up, they're not really your responsibility anymore. Now, they're somewhat your responsibility because they always remain your child, but when a child grows up and leaves your home, there is a difference in how you interact with them. Yes, you are still their parent. Yes, they should still honor you. Yes, you are still responsible for them. You should care for them. You should love them. But your relationship has changed, and there are different ways that both of you interact in that situation. So, you know, if my children grow up and they go off the rails and become disobedient, if they've left home, they're not really under my control anymore. So there's not really much I can do about it. It's an issue of authority there. If they still live with me and they're little children, they're a lot easier to discipline and to educate and for me to take responsibility of. The next question is, I would say, repeated offenses. You know, was this one-off situation where the kids were just being little brats and mucking around? Or is this a repeated, constant, ongoing issue in which the children are just always being disobedient and mucking around? With that, there also comes into the question as to what is the pastor's response to that? Is he trying? Like, sometimes you can't be blamed for what other people do. There is this saying of, we are responsible for our response. So I can't control how others behave. I can only control how I behave. Yes, as a parent, I have some authority over my kids, and so I can somewhat control how they behave, but I'm not a puppet master. I do not have full sovereignty over my children. They are free-thinking individuals. But you need to ask, if they're running around being wild and disobedient, am I trying my best to fix the problem, or do I not care? Because if you have a pastor that has disobedient children and he just does not care and he does not do anything to try and fix the situation, then that is definitely someone who should be defrocked. But if he's trying his hardest and he just can't get his children to behave, that's not really his fault. You got to remember that we are responsible for our own sins. The Bible talks about not blaming the father for the sins of the child or the child for the sins of the father. St. Jerome speaks about this, commenting on these recommendations in the pastoral epistles. And Jerome says that parents aren't to be blamed because of the way their children turn out, because that children are ultimately responsible for their own behavior. And the example he gives is the example of Esau. That it's not really up to Isaac and Rebecca to be blamed for what Esau goes and does later. Or again, another example that people talk about is like Absalom. Is David to be blamed for all the things Absalom goes and does? Well, no, not really. We could probably argue that David has some responsibility in that whole situation, but that's a conversation for another day. So the question is whether you are to defrock this pastor is you need to consider, are the children out of his control because they're grown up, or are they still under his authority? Is this a regular occurrence, or is this a one-off, spur of the moment, every now and again his kids misbehave? And how does he respond to it? Is he not caring, or is he trying to fix the problem? Those are things that should be considered before you defrock a pastor. Now, there is, however, the situation of ordaining versus defrocking. So, Pastor Magnus Sorensen talks about this, where he says, look, nobody has the right to become a pastor. Therefore, it should be actually quite difficult to become a pastor. However, if a church has called and ordained somebody, we are commanded by God to honor, respect, and submit to that pastor, and therefore, it should be a difficult thing to remove them from the office of the ministry. It should be just as difficult to remove someone as it is as difficult to ordain someone. So when you're looking at like a pastor or a pastoral candidate and their ability to control their children, there is a difference between the already ordained pastor and the person wanting to become a pastor. If a person is already ordained, we shouldn't just defrock them over every slight little problem. It should be a big, serious thing to defrock a pastor. So, if a pastor has disobedient children, don't just defrock him there and then, but think long and hard and consider the situation before you defrock him. However, if we're looking at somebody who wants to enter the office of the ministry, as Pastor Sorensen of the coelc said, no one has a right to be a pastor. Therefore, we actually have quite a high bar that a person should meet before they be ordained. So if we are looking at someone who is a pastoral candidate and they are not able to control their children, we would be more willing to prevent that individual from entering the office of the ministry. We need to remember that what Paul is saying here is what are the requirements for someone becoming a pastor. If you want to have someone be a pastor, they shouldn't be bad-tempered. They shouldn't have disobedient children. We have to look at the situation when we're calling a pastor, and we have a high bar for those we are calling. But when it comes to defrocking someone, we should also have a high bar of bad things that they have done before we defrock them. We should not ordain anybody lightly, and we should not defrock anyone lightly. And we can actually see this when we look at what Johann Gerhard and Aegidius Huninus said regarding the epistles of Timothy and Titus. So Gerhard says regarding the epistles of Timothy that one can demonstrate his ability to manage his household well. Therefore, if he can do that, he should move from the small house, the home, to the big house, the church. So Gerhard is saying, look, these requirements of can you manage your household well, that's not for the already ordained pastors, that's for the pastoral candidates. When we're calling someone to be a minister, we look at them and say, well, he does run his household pretty well, so I think he would be a good pastor. Or we say, he doesn't really run his household really well, I don't think he would make a good pastor, so better not ordain him. So Gerhard actually taught that these requirements in Timothy were not, reasons to kick someone out of the ministry if they don't keep up the standards, but more as to what are the standards we set when we want to call someone in the first place. And we can also see something similar in Aegidius Huninus's commentary on Titus, where he speaks about Paul giving these requirements as to how bishops or pastors were to be chosen. And they were chosen by looking at their example before their call as to how they managed their families. So what we actually have in both Gerhard and Hunenes is a precedent that the list of requirements for the office of the ministry in Timothy and Titus were not a list of, well, if the pastor doesn't keep up this high standard, we're going to kick him out next week. Instead, they should be, we need to ordain people, so what high standard do they need to reach before they are ordained? So the question was, based on Timothy and Titus, if a pastor's children are being disobedient, should we defrock him? That doesn't really mesh with what actually the Lutheran reformers, how they interpreted Timothy and Titus. They saw these lists as a list of requirements for the calling of a pastor. So it's not really, you open up Timothy 3 and you go, well, pastor's not keeping up all these requirements, so let's defrock him. It was meant to be, when you're examining a pastoral candidate, you go, does he meet all these requirements before we ordain him? So basically, in short, should we or could we defrock a pastor if his children are disobedient? The answer is yes, we might need to, depending on the situation, but we shouldn't be hastily defrocking pastors. This is a very serious matter, and therefore it should be a really serious offense before we defrock the pastor. However, not everybody has a right to be a minister, and so we should have a high bar when we examine and call men into the office of the ministry. We should not hastily lay hands on anyone and just ordain everyone willy-nilly into the office of the ministry. Therefore, we set a higher standard for those who are trying to enter the ministry than for those who are already in the ministry. So, yes, if a pastor is already ordained and his kids start mucking around and he can't control them, that's not necessarily a reason to defrock him. But if a pastoral candidate was in the same situation, that may be a reason not to ordain him. So I hope that answers the question. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.